the whole of this meeting, and then our next joint board meeting David will chair, and we will take it in turns so that we're not ping-ponging backwards and forwards in the middle of the meeting. I should actually formally welcome you, David, to your first joint board meeting together, and also welcome Munir to the NHS England board. We've got a few apologies. Unfortunately, Tim Ferris has had to rush off to get a plane back to Boston. Cathy McLean, Ben Dyson, Wendy Becker and Steve Powers. But other than that, we have a pretty full complement of people. Are there any additional declarations of interest that people need to make? No. Excellent. Before we, and let's take the minutes next, have we got any comments on the previous minutes from the previous meeting? Any additions or changes to the minutes? Okay, we will take those. In which case, I've got one item I wanted just to take at the beginning, which is just to confirm one further appointment to the joint NHS executive team. Ian, do you just want to talk us through?
Yes, delighted to. I'm absolutely delighted to be able to announce that we made an appointment to the NHS Chief People Officer post, which is one of the key national leadership posts, and I think reflects the importance of workforce to the future work of the NHS. So I'm absolutely delighted to announce that we've appointed Prerna Issar to the role of Chief People Officer. Prerna will play the leading role ensuring that the NHS in England has enough people with the right skills and the right experience and that they are supported well enough to ensure that the improvements for patients that we've set out in the long-term plan actually take place. We know that it's impossible to achieve things without having the staff in the right place and in the right quantity to do that. Prerna brings huge experience and indeed expertise from both public and the private sector. She joins us from the United Nations, where she's been the Chief Human Resources Officer for the World Food Programme for 4 years. She's had, before that, extensive top-level HR global experience, including at Unilever. So I think she's got huge experience. The other thing I think I was struck with was the personal passion for people and for the NHS that she discussed with us as part of the appointment process. So I think when I think about what's going to give us the chance to really make sure that the LTP, the long-term plan, is delivered for our patients, I think Prerna's involvement as part of our national leadership team, making sure that people agenda is absolutely up there, I think is a key appointment. So we'll be sending, I think, a press release out imminently, but I'm really looking forward to us working with Prerna over the next few years.
I think she'll be starting at the beginning of April. She currently lives in Rome, so we'll be commuting over initially. But I think had her second child at the Royal Free, so she has lived in the UK and is looking forward to coming back. So I'm sure we will all welcome her. Okay. So if we go to the agenda then, our first item, building the case for primary legislative change. Ian, are you leading off with that?
Yes,
Or is you?
I
can't
Great.
see you, rather.
Thanks, Dido. So a few introductory comments from me before we open up the discussion. We don't need NHS primary legislation to implement the long-term plan, but undoubtedly it would help. And that's why the long-term plan itself included a prioritised list of highly targeted specific changes aimed at solving practical problems that people in the NHS are experiencing. And following on from that, I'm today inviting the boards to launch an engagement process on our proposed changes. And this is fleshing out what was in pages 112 to 114 of the long-term plan, rather than a much longer list of suggestions. I think it's worth noting that it's an unusual opportunity for the NHS. Following the invitation originally from the Prime Minister to independently of government make our own specific proposals. And so we're encouraging as many people and organisations as possible to make their voice heard through filling in our simple survey at the back and online, as well as offering more detailed insights during the 8-week engagement window. And in the light of what we hear, we've said in our document that we will publish a full response and will make firm, specific proposals to government. I think it almost goes without saying that the stronger the support we receive, then I think the stronger the case for government and Parliament to act and act quickly on those recommendations. It's also worth noting that the Health and Social Care Select Committee, who've made recommendations in this area, are also continuing their work here. So what exactly are we proposing? In summary, we are trying to improve collaboration in the NHS, specifically by removing the 2012 Act provisions that increased the role of the Competition and Mergers Authority in core NHS business such as trust mergers, whilst keeping their vital work in tackling abuses in markets such as generic medicine pricing. Remove the 2012 Act duties and powers for Monitor to act as a competition authority so that NHS improvement can focus on improvement. Scrap Section 75 of the 2012 Act, which gave Monitor enforcement duties over commissioners, including to set aside procurements, as well as enshrining rigid and costly procurement requirements which are also inconsistent with the separate public procurement regulations. We're proposing to remove the NHS from the public contract regulations so that the NHS is more free to decide the circumstances in when it goes out to procurement. And very importantly, this would be subject, we propose, to a best value test that we intend to set out in NHS statutory guidance. And this is all the while we would maintain and indeed strengthen, bearing in mind the specific commitments in the long-term plan around choice, to strengthening patient rights to choice and indeed personal budgets. And there was an announcement on that recently following a joint consultation that NHS England had with government. We're proposing greater flexibility for how the national tariff operates, to support new payment models that aid care integration. We're proposing to remove the 2012 Act repeal of the ability of the Secretary of State to create NHS trusts. This is to make it easier to help systems such as, for example, Dudley, who have been developing what they call their MCP model, to create a statutory provider that could integrate community and primary care services without having to go through a complicated process of, in essence, demerger from an existing FT. And without changing the core FT model or freedoms. That's a really important point around accountability, because we're not here fundamentally trying to change the core accountabilities in the NHS. We're trying to solve particular problems. We propose two highly targeted adjustments in relation to the FT regime. And the first is to support mergers or acquisitions of FTs in specified circumstances where this is really clearly in the patient interest. You know, for example, if there's unanimous NHS, public, stakeholder and local community support for a merger, all bar, say, the board of a particular FT. And then secondly, to avoid NHS trusts being disadvantaged relative to FTs in relation to capital bids. Now, this wasn't actually an issue, all the while the CDEL looked pretty generous, but given it's had to be substantially constrained in recent years, in turn, it's become necessary for NHS improvement to turn down what can be strong proposals from NHS trusts for, say, A&E capital bids, simply because there is no constraint on annual FT capital spend. Bearing in mind there is an overall national limit. And this is patently unfair for NHS trusts. And I just want to emphasise two things here. One, we are not proposing to change the wider existing FT freedoms on capital. And the intention is that we work very closely with stakeholders, including NHS providers, in getting the detail of both of these provisions right. We're also proposing to remove the restriction on local NHS organisations, particularly FTs, to be able to create joint decision-making committees with other providers and CCGs. And I think this proposal, we think, will really aid ICS governance. And as ICSs cover the country by 2021 and are typically served by one CCG, we think it would be balmy to create what would be a duplicative and expensive separate statutory vehicle for ICSs rather than use this new flexibility around joint committees. It's also worth noting that CCG governing bodies currently have to include a designated secondary care doctor and nurse, but they have to be bussed in from another locality under legislation. This is, again, a hangover of changes made a few years ago. They can't work in the local trust, and so that's clearly at odds with the long-term plan goals, and we're proposing to scrap that restriction. It would also make life easier for CCGs. In a similar spirit of collaboration, whilst CCGs and providers can, we think, under current legislation, choose to have joint appointments, the law could be clearer on this point, and that's what we're proposing, with obvious safeguards around managing conflicts of interest, for example, on procurement decisions. To further cement collaboration, we propose that CCGs and providers should have a shared duty to support the triple aim: better health and well-being for their local community, better quality care, as well as sustainable local systems, so that success is shared success rather than one institution thriving whilst another struggles. We already have a pretty extensive array of powers around how the NHS can join forces with local government. In statute through joint commissioning arrangements, Section 75 of the 2006 Act, as well as integrated provision. But we do actually have quite a lot of restrictions internally in the NHS on how we join up the commissioning pound, and so we're proposing to make it easier by changing arrangements that stop what is double delegation of primary medical services to committees of CCGs, as well as the all-or-nothing approach to commissioning specialised services. Either they have to be only commissioned by NHS England, not with their CCG or ICS partners, or we delist them and it's just CCGs, and we're proposing that we should be able to have joint commissioning arrangements between NHS England and CCGs in relation to SpecCom. And then finally, to aid national collaboration, we propose either the full merger of NHS England and Improvement, or at the very least, more freedom to go further in our joint venture than is currently permissible. And so, Chair, I commend these proposals to both boards.
Comments? Reactions?
Okay.
Joanne? Or David, do you want to start?
No, it's really a question both for Ian and Simon, I think, just in terms of the political realities. You know, what would you, if you were to put how likely is it this will become into legislation in the next 2 or 3 years, do you think?
Right, looking at 2 or 3 years as against even, say, to March 29th. Well, first of all, we obviously proposed the core in the long-term plan, and those proposals were very well received. Widely well received. So in that sense, I think we start with a advantage in that both from within the NHS and also as part of the sort of national debate on the NHS, there are a lot of people who can see the sense of what is being proposed here. So I don't think it's that there is substantive disagreement, but the reason we want to have this engagement process is to make sure that we are properly hearing the points of nuance and whether there are other elements that people across the NHS want. Then the question will be a matter for a Parliament and for government. We would intend working closely with the Health and Social Care Committee and potentially the Public Accounts Committee, so they would both be able to scrutinise the proposals which we are recommending, and then following that it would obviously be for government to decide whether as part of its legislative programme time can be made available and how that fits with the overall sort of parliamentary business. But so far so good. We've got a fair wind behind the proposals that we put on the table, and we now want to use this engagement process to broaden that conversation more widely.
Could I add one specific, Simon Dido, which is that just around timing. So even if the process were to move as rapidly as you could conceive, and if there were to be even a bill introduced for pre-legislative scrutiny later this calendar year, even if it were then to be prioritised, by the time you'd get to royal assent and then commencement, it's quite hard to see how you'd get provisions actually up and running probably before, I think, April 2020. 2022 would be my guess as the earliest possible moment from this. So although we're making a number of important suggestions here, it's also important that our stakeholders appreciate that if we are successful, this wouldn't be arriving any day soon.
I'd just add to that, I think that underlines the importance of the message that you gave, that we outlined in the long-term plan a set of sensible legislative changes that we thought would help the implementation, but that the implementation of the long-term plan, which has to start now, can't be dependent upon or in sequence to those legislative changes. So I think it's just worth underlining that these are a necessary and I think helpful potential set of changes, but we still have work to do during the period, potentially quite an extended period, as you've just outlined.
Joanne?
Thank you. I mean, as I think colleagues know, we support quite an active network of CCG audit chairs. And one question that comes up quite frequently from members of the network is about the current prohibition in legislation between sitting on a CCG board and sitting on an acute hospital board, even when they're not in the same areas. And I think people find that quite frustrating, and they wonder, whether that helps them or how that might help them understand the world from the other, as it were, the other side, and work together more collaboratively. So the extent to which that can be ironed out through this process, I think, would be very welcome. And then my question was I wondered if there's any more information that you could share with us about what the best value test might be like, and how that's going to be incisive without being too bureaucratic.
So I think, thank you for the positive comment about the joint appointments. I think on the best value test, we really want to engage our stakeholders on what that would look like, and then set out more clearly, having heard their views at the end of the consultation process.
Matthew?
Thank you. This is an exceptionally good piece of work here. Congratulations. And I think, whilst, as you say, we can deliver the long-term plan without it, I think you've narrowed down on a number of the key blockages that will enable systems to work better together and staff to move faster at the benefit of patients. I was really pleased to hear you refer to embedding the triple aim and as part of moving the NHS to kind of thinking about population health. Issue of health improvement has been increasingly talking about the quadruple aim, and in a very American way adding the joy of work, or your workforce and your staff as part of the quadruple aim. And I wonder whether we might think about having the quadruple aim embedded rather than the triple aim as we think about that.
Ara, you keen to come in? And then David?
Thank you, Ian. Like Matthew, delighted to see that he put a significant amount of thinking behind this. And this is an impressive list of priority changes that need to happen. What disappoints me, we're going to wait till the World Cup for this to come through. And it's halfway through the first 5 years of the long-term plan. So there must be something that could be done in achieving some of these goals within the legal framework that we have. And what could we do to enable that? The taxpayer has increased the budget by about 3.4%. They will be alarmed to see that there are certain structural restrictions in which will cause significant waste of money without the impact that check comes in that envelope in terms of the delivery of the long-term plan. So there must be other ways of getting around this rather than waiting for the World Cup.
And I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that we are trying to role model that here in our joint organisation, in trying to push as far as we can without the need for legislative change. Though recognising that actually legislative change would make it undeniably simpler were this one organisation.
And the one thing, there are many examples across all these areas where we can crack on and make progress. So just using my Dudley example, actually there are lots of conversations going on about how they might be able to create a statutory vehicle to deliver their integrated care provider contract rather than waiting till 2021. Specifically just on ICSs, we have said really clearly in the long-term plan that you can set up partnership boards. And far more important than this is actually getting the behaviours right. The legislation simply makes life a bit easier. There's a lot of areas where it's far more important to actually just crack on with the programmes of work we've already set out in the long-term plan itself. You can change payment mechanisms. You can have partnership boards. You can align your clinicians across primary and secondary care. This just, as I say, should help us be able to go faster and probably deliver those changes more effectively. We can't be certain, as Simon was indicating earlier, about what the result is here. So I think we need to avoid assuming, actually, that we do necessarily get these changes even in 2022.
David.
So actually, thank you, Dido. I think sort of Joanne took my first point, Ara took my second point, actually, which is great. I think recognising I was using my retirement date rather than the World Cup. Yours is a much more erudite and exciting and joyful experience. But I think, given what Ian's just said, I think it would be really helpful. First of all, I think it's really important that people don't think that it's in 2022, therefore I shouldn't respond to the engagement. If the case is strong, the pressure is therefore higher, and therefore, we should all take that opportunity. The second thing, however, is recognising that there is a big gap of 3 years potentially. I think it'd be really important that we provide some practical, tangible, really short steps that people can take now within the framework of the legislation to be able to make things easier, particularly around the establishment of ICSs. And I know we've sort of done that, but I think, to Ian's point, just make it really accessible and easy to get hold of and give people a confidence, because sometimes the legislation is used as a reason not to. What we should try and do is find this is the reason how to. Yeah? So, but back to the point, I think this is a sensible, targeted, well-written, unargued case. We should all provide our views through the engagement programme.
Richard, did you want to come in?
And you mentioned already that to some extent the way this board is operating exhibits some of the things that we're trying to do now to make sure we can bring elements together. And I just wonder again, in the context of this legislative timetable, clearly we have got to focus ourselves on what more can we do as set out in paragraph 77 about having a single voice and a single approach at a national level. I just wonder if you say anything about that.
Yes, well, I think there's an option that's suggested here for engagement with the NHS at paragraph 78 as to whether we should be advocating for a single NHS England and NHS improvement, or simply mechanisms that enable the two bodies to work more closely together. And it would be useful, in the light of what you've just said, Richard, to hear from the board as to whether or not the board has a view on that question at this juncture. And noting that we have 4 members of the legislature on this board, and therefore that to the extent there are questions about delay or World Cups, looking in the mirror and taking some personal responsibility for that would be entirely appropriate.
Yes. My lord.
Looking over the hill, as I say.
Yes.
I think, in response to that last point, I think this is really most welcome. It's an excellent paper, and I think it points the way. I don't think we could have done it before, and I think now is the opportunity to do this, and it may take till the World Cup. But the fact is we should get on the journey, and I think in answer to that last question, I personally would favour formalising much more of those things coming together if we could do that. And I would vote for it had it come to that.
Well,
I think just to amplify Pat's point, is it worth setting out the goal? Because there are so many friction costs involved in the way we operate. And even if we put the legislation to one side and operate as a single entity anyway, the clunkiness, I mean, I'll just give you an example. The fact that monitor and a TDA is separate means audit, we have separate audit approaches, separate things to do, separate accounts, all of which cost money. But fundamentally, if the goal is to be one entity, we should be stating that case as to why it makes sense to be one entity, rather than talking about legislation. So I'm just wondering if we could do a bit more of that in the document that goes out for consultation, rather than making it an option, because it's not clear to me that we're really saying it is a good thing.
Yeah. Other views? I mean, I would certainly agree with you, well, that being clear that acting as one is what we're trying to do, and having the legal underpinning for that in due course would be immeasurably helpful. Is that a fair summary of people's views?
I would certainly support that.
Okay. Brilliant. Any further comments to the paper as a whole? I must say, and I think it's a really excellent piece of work, as Matthew said, so congratulations to the team in pulling something together, and we look forward to people's views on it as we start the engagement process.
Could I also, and I know he couldn't be here today, but this has been absolutely a joint endeavour with Ben Dyson and his team and legal colleagues.
Yeah.
So the credit is as much with them.
Indeed, well said. Thank you. Okay, moving on to our next agenda item, establishing the NHS Assembly. Simon, are you going to kick us off?
Well, very briefly, but I think probably Ruth is going to come in as well, perhaps unbeknownst to Ruth, looking at her face. But yes. Right, she's now had 15 seconds to gather her thoughts. So, again, in the long-term plan, we were clear that in order to drive the change, we need to implement the LTP. This has got to be mobilisation across the health service. This is not something that can be done in a top-down way by even a joined-up NHS England and NHS Improvement, and we need a guiding coalition formalised that draws on the folks who were involved in bringing the LTP into creation, but actually now helps us chart that journey, think about the trade-offs, get our own operating model right, be the critical friend for the changes that we need to produce in terms of our combined organisation. So that's the purpose of the NHS Assembly as set out. We have advertised for the co-chairs and will be advertising and appointing a wider array of stakeholders. Ruth.
About the announcements?
Yes.
Okay, good. We interviewed, was it yesterday or the day before? One of these days. Yesterday. Monday, was it? Okay, the week's going very, very, very fast. We were fortunate enough to, Lord Prior and Dido, myself and Steve, we interviewed a couple of candidates, and we're really pleased that we are going to be working with two co-chairs, one clinical chair and one non-clinical chair. And it's Chris Ham. So Chris Ham, I'm really pleased to be working with him with his vast amount of experience as a non-clinical chair, and also with Claire Gerarda. And both of those individuals working together will chair the NHS Assembly. Obviously working clinical and non-clinical is really important as we get the buy-in of all of our people that will be joining us on the Assembly.
David?
Yeah, I think we're lucky. I mean, we were very much appointing a team, a complementary team. And I think Chris's long commitment to integrated care, there's one thing printed on in Chris's DNA, it's integrated care, and that's a fundamental part of the 10-year plan. And then Claire's commitment both to primary care and to mental health, actually, again, really important. So the two coming together, I think, are excellent sort of co-chairs for the National Assembly, the NHS Assembly. I was struck because Don Berwick was over here in London 2 weeks ago, and he said, this is what's encapsulated in the 10-year plan is probably the most exciting vision for modern healthcare in the world, and that no other system in the world had come up with this kind of 10-year sort of forward view encompassing the whole of healthcare in the UK. And I think the NHS Assembly is one of those sort of innovations that could be hugely powerful and exciting. And I think with Chris and Claire leading it, we got off to a very good start.
Yeah. I would say that we had some fantastic candidates apply, and very grateful for a number of people putting their hat into the ring. And it was not a straightforward choice in selecting both Claire and Chris, but we're incredibly lucky to have them. Michelle.
Thank you. Great to see the plans for the Assembly developing and the recruitment of the co-chairs. I'm really keen to hear your reflections on the role of people, patients, citizens, in the shaping of the Assembly and the degree to which the Assembly will work with and alongside the charity sector?
So it was fascinating to see both of the, well, actually all of the candidates talk very much about it, but the two people, Claire and Chris, both of them were talking about very much wanting a diverse people as part of the Assembly, wanting to make sure there was people from all sorts of backgrounds, whether it's third sector, from professionals, the Royal Colleges and the like. So I think there's going to be a hard job for those two chairs to decide.
Patient leaders.
Absolutely, there was definitely those conversations. I think the hard job's going to be, there's going to be more people wanting to be there than there's going to be space enough to have. So I think it's going to be interesting as well to ensure that there's a geographical spread as much as a diverse spread. But they were both up for that challenge.
Other comments? Contributions? I would say that applications are still open for people who are interested to apply to be members of the Assembly, isn't that right? I think until the 8th of March from memory? 6th of March, sorry. So I would encourage people who are watching or listening to this who are interested. We do want to have as wide a field of people to choose from who are keen to contribute to shaping the future of the NHS. Stephen, did you want to come in, or was that a scratch of the hair? Sorry, I'm fatal. You'll find yourself contributing if you're not very careful. Excellent. Well, we look forward to working with Chris and Claire and listening hard to the Assembly as it forms. Fantastic. Okay, our next item on the agenda is an update from the DPC, the Delivery, Performance and Quality Committee, our new joint committee in common that looks at overseeing the financial, operational and quality performance and delivery of our joint organisations and of the system as a whole. We held our first full meeting on the 30th of January with David and I co-chairing. I think we've published now the minutes from that meeting. I thought it would be helpful just to have a brief update on a couple of the topics on that agenda. Maybe firstly, Ian, if you just wanted to sort of headline a bit on the operational financial performance of the system, particularly cognizant that we are still really in the midst, even though the sun is shining outside, in the midst of winter, and then maybe turn to sort of Simon and Matthew to update on Brexit.
Fine, yeah, thanks, Dido. I think just a bit of context from me, really. The Delivery, Performance and Quality Committee, which will be where the two boards, effectively, of NHS Improvement and NHS England come together to have a national overview of quality, performance and finance within the NHS. It's arguably the first time that any national entity has been able to take the holistic view of those things across the National Health Service in this country for many years. Previously, NHS Improvement has always looked at the provider sector, and NHS England at the commissioner sector. And so I think in a way it's a tangible and significant step for us looking at the NHS as a whole rather than its constituent parts. We did have a wide-ranging and important discussion. I'll just touch on a couple of quick issues, really. We talked about the planning round coming up. We just issued the planning guidance when we met. CCG allocations were out giving commissioners the financial understanding of their positions. We had headlined in that a new financial settlement that puts real cash, £1 billion extra down into the provider sector as a means of a definitive and decisive move away from deficits while starting to achieve the long-term plan. And we did talk about, therefore, the importance of that and making sure that as we move through the planning round, the NHS rises to the challenge, and we support the NHS to rise to the challenge to deliver the improvements we need to see in 1920 but also to embed the new financial architecture and to see, for instance, trust deficits reduced by over 50%, which is our commitment with the new money from next year. We're about to go into the planning round and we'll be discussing that, I'm sure, at future meetings. But obviously it's incredibly important that we get a set of plans. We support the NHS to have a set of plans that actually give us confidence in delivery next year. So we had a big discussion on planning, and that was important. We discussed winter, and I think in the context of a situation in which December and into January performance had been better than last year. I think the NHS worked incredibly hard to flow patients through, and real credit to NHS staff for the work that was achieved in the face of continuing and rising demand. So we reviewed the fact that the 5.6% increase in A&E attendances relative to the same time last year, and the consequent pressure that has built in the system, despite the fact that in January, we saw 1.78 million patients within 4 weeks, which is a significant 4.4% increase on the year before. So we did talk about winter and the work that was going on to ensure that the improvements that we need to see are delivered. I think we concluded that the reform process, the development of the initiatives 111, same-day emergency care, urgent treatment centre, reduction of long-stay patients had all made a critical difference to the way winter was working this year, even though I know it's tough out there on the front line. So I think that was a good discussion. And then we spent a bit of time inevitably talking about the NHS's financial position. We'll be shortly issuing month 9 numbers in the Q3 report. But I think what we reflected on once again was a firm commitment from both NHS England and NHS Improvement when we look at the finances of the NHS as a whole to ensure that the 18-19 finances of the NHS are ultimately in balance at the end of the year. We've seen, I think, in the face of continuing rising demand, a deterioration in some small number of trusts that has made the aggregate position more challenging, but I think we discussed the measures that we were taking to support those trusts and others to ensure that the group as a whole balances at the end of the year, and I think we'll be reflecting that we believe we're on track with that. So I think that was a further good discussion, effectively giving us a chance to consider whether the NHS as a whole was going to do what it needed to financially this year, and I think we do feel that that was on track and remains on track.
Shall we pause there before we go to Brexit? Are there any comments or questions regarding current operational financial performance? Elizabeth, would you like to add a bit more?
Just to add to what Ian said, really. So we are in good shape at this stage of the year, going into the final quarter. But clearly there's a lot to do, so it's just to really re-emphasise that we are managing a lot of risk, and we need people to continue with the same level of rigour and financial control that we would expect, because as importantly as delivering this year is the platform for the long-term plan. So we must ensure that we don't lose it in the final quarter. I have to say we do have a line of sight by provider and commissioner about how this can be achieved, and I feel more comfortable this year than I have in previous years now, working with colleagues as closely as we do.
Yeah. Matthew, is there anything you'd like to add on operational performance and winter particularly?
I don't. Yeah, only to say that the focus continues to be very close. I think Pauline is all over this every day, and I think the sense is that while performance is disappointing, safety has been maintained well across the system, and as we go into the planning round, getting it right and getting the capacities right is what Ian has been very focused on over the past few months. So I think it's. I'm not sure there's anything that I need to add.
Fantastic, thank you. Ara, would you any comments on quality? I know we had our first joint quality committee in common, which reports up into this group.
Thank you, Chair. I've been sitting on the quality committee as part of the NHS improvement for about a year or 18 months. What was different yesterday, again in line with what we talked about earlier, is we got both NHSE, NHSI sitting in one room to talk about quality. And that's really what matters from a patient's perspective. It's the whole pathway of care. So the one thing we also do very well in the NHS, we measure a lot of stuff, but we don't connect them up. So the idea to be able to measure across a pathway of care and make against a standard, and we're very good in setting up standards. The National Institute of Health and Clinical Excellence sets standards, the National Quality Board appraises these standards. So through the executive, the medical director, the chief nursing officer, I hope we will see in the next meeting a much better integrated data sets across the whole pathway of care from the cradle to the grave, with clear sets of indicators that are meaningful to clinicians who will be excited about quality improvement, to the patients to build their confidence in quality and safety in the system, and obviously to the taxpayer in terms of creating better value as we move into the long-term plan. So very exciting, and it's not rocket science, but it's bringing people together to think of what is the organizing principle of the NHS that we've all have signed up to, that it should be quality.
It's good progress. Thank you. Dare I mention the Brexit word? Sam,
sure, and I'll bring that in just a moment. So since we last met, obviously a lot of the further work that we laid out for you previously around looking at supply chain has been undertaken with the Department of Health and Social Care in the lead. We've got 12,300 medicines that have been reviewed, nearly 500,000 product lines for medical devices and clinical consumables, vaccines, other assorted medical goods, remembering that about 3/4 of registered medicines come into this country from or via the European Union, and over half of our clinical consumables. So that review process has been undertaken with assurance sought from the suppliers. The work that the Department of Health has been doing with the Department of Transport has moved on quite a long way. I think it's no secret that a couple of weeks ago, frankly, we had concerns about the position in respect of seaborne, but mitigations are being put in place that we review on a weekly basis with the Department of Health around Ro-Ro, around air. And so the next steps that Matthew and Keith Willett, and I want to thank both of them very much for their continuing leadership in this area, we're doing with the NHS over the next 10 days is the trust-specific, CCG-specific, local-specific stocktake on not just these supply chain issues, but some of the other matters that are relevant as well. But Matthew.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Simon. So I think since we last spoke, Professor Keith Willett has been on his roadshow around the country and has delivered talks to senior leadership in all parts of the country on Brexit, and making sure that people understand what is going on and what they need to be doing. I think that has been very well received. We found that we've had at those events the local police coming to them, local authorities coming, as well as the local NHS. So they've been I think very good events for local systems coming together. We've now I think got good clarity down into the system of what we require every provider to be able to do, be it a big hospital or be it a community service or primary care, in terms of tracking their stock positions, letting us know, ensuring that we have captured every product that they use locally in order that we have made provision for it, and what happens if there's a problem. So how, as an NHS, we can flex to make sure that supplies from one place get somewhere else if that's necessary. So I think good progress being made there, both locally and through our regional hubs, and the central team that's been put together in partnership between ourselves and the Department of Health in order to provide coherence. Obviously, our preference is that problems get sorted as locally as possible. We don't want everything to hit a central team. We want to be able to enable the communications locally so that things are sorted locally, and where necessary it gets escalated. So I think good progress is going on around those things. And we're now reaching out to make sure that it isn't just the NHS, it isn't just but we're into talking to private sector providers of NHS services, care homes, including small care homes, making sure that they have a mechanism if there is a product that they need in order to keep a bed open and they've got a shortage, how do they contact our wider system to make sure that we can keep the whole of the system flowing. So a huge amount of work going on. I think it's moving at pace. I think we have the appropriate senior engagement now. I think, would that be your view, Ian, that people are now kind of really focused on it? Clearly, we hope we don't have to deal with a no-deal Brexit situation, but we are increasingly geared up to do so if we need to.
Ian, anything to add?
No, I think Matthew's outlined it very clearly.
Excellent. Questions or comments? Excellent. I think we should sort of draw this item to a close by marking our enormous gratitude to how hard everyone is working within NHS Improvement and NHS England, but also all across the system in serving patients at our most challenging time of year at the same time as preparing those contingency plans and planning for the implementation of our exciting long-term vision. There are a lot of different things happening and people are juggling that incredibly well. So I think we should all finish that by saying thank you for that. With that, takes us to any other business. Are there any other items on the agenda that people would like to pick up? No? In which case, I think we will call the meeting to an end. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you all for very excellent papers and good contribution.